Last week, Mike talked about the way of knowledge versus the way of love. We've been in 1 Corinthians for a number of months now, and he spoke on that message out of 1 Corinthians 8. Today I'm going to be primarily speaking out of 1 Corinthians 9, and almost as a part two, I'm going to be talking about the way of rights versus the way of love. The way of rights versus the way of love. So I'm going to be talking about rights today, but more specifically, I actually want to call into question a little some of our conceptions about what we call rights, or at least the fervor with which we hold to them. So rights are generally divided into two categories in modern Western thought. This is going to get a bit tedious at points, but I'm going to try to keep it practical. Right? So in Western thought, we think of human rights, or as they're often called, inalienable rights, and we think of legal rights. So in the category of a legal right, and hopefully it's not too contentious saying this isn't a basic human right, but a legal right, you might think of the right to bear arms. Right? This is something that many would say is given to us through our Constitution, and hence it is a legal right. But it's not the same as, for example, the right to life, or by extension even, the right to defend oneself from someone else who's trying to take your life. The right to self-defense is seen by most to be more basic and intrinsic to our humanity than the right to bear arms. The right to self-defense, in other words, stems from our humanity, whereas the right to do so specifically through the use of a legally acquired weapon is a contingent right that is granted through the law. In other words, it's a right that could be changed without violating anything intrinsic to our humanity. Now, at this point in the sermon, you may already be asking yourself, what on earth am I getting into? Did I step into another college lecture about human rights? Well, let's hopefully bring it down to earth a little bit more. See if my coffee is cool enough to drink. You put it in a carafe. The problem is sometimes my wife could drink it, but it's often too hot for me 10 minutes later. Success. All right. So many of you are students, so it's not a far stretch to say imagine you're a student. But for those of you who aren't, you can imagine you're a student. So imagine you show up to class one day and you find out that there's a pop quiz. You're not expecting it, and so you haven't really prepared for it. And worse, you find out that the professor is basing 50% of the course grade on this pop quiz. You take it and you're pretty sure you bombed it. And afterward, you indignantly declare to your classmates, he had no right to do this. You probably don't mean that he's violating something intrinsic to your humanity by weighting the pop quiz so heavily. Rather, you probably have this innate sense that he is acting out of step with reasonable standards of fairness, perhaps even standards that the school generally follows and has laid down. Now, on the other hand, imagine you discover that your best friend was slapped in the face by her boyfriend because she made him angry. Even worse, she's actually defending his actions and saying it was her fault because of how angry she made him. In response, you tell her emphatically, he had no right to lay a finger on you. Now, in that context, you probably do mean that what he did is a violation of something much deeper to her than simply a standard of fairness. It seems to be a violation of something that's intrinsic to her very humanity. What this shows is that the concept of rights is not only an important concept in our legal framework, but actually comes up all the time the way we, in daily discourse. Just think of how often you tell someone, well, I'm going to do that because I have the right to do it, or such and such didn't have a right to do that. Whether it's in a power relation, speaking about your boss, or simply among equals, among friends, something like that. The language is prevalent in our culture. Now, I'm not going to claim today that the Bible has the same concept of rights, the concept of rights that we have in the West. We have the advantage of sitting 2,000 years after the New Testament was developed and thinking a lot through some of the groundwork that is laid there. And so we have a much more full and drawn-out concept than what is present in the Bible as a whole, and certainly in the New Testament. But there are points of contact. The Bible does speak of rights. It uses the same language in ways that have contact with our concept today. Specifically, this is brought into focus in the book we've been looking at in 1 Corinthians. And so if you have your Bibles, like I said, you can turn to 1 Corinthians 9. We're going to read this chapter, most of it. We're going to read it at length. And then I'm going to draw on some principles that I think are being discussed here. So, chapter 9, starting at verse 1. Paul speaking. Am I not free? Am I not an apostle? Have I not seen Jesus our Lord? Are you not the result of my work in the Lord? Even though I may not be an apostle to others, surely I am to you, for you are the seal of my apostleship in the Lord. Now, this is a church that Paul has planted. It's not like the book of Rome where he is coming to another church that doesn't know him well. This is the church he's intimately connected with, so this is where this language is coming from. Verse 3, this is my defense to those who sit in judgment on me. Don't we have the right to food and drink? Don't we have the right to take a believing wife along with us, as do the other apostles and the Lord's brother and Cephas? Or is it only I and Barnabas who lack the right to not work for a living? Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? Who plants a vineyard and does not eat its grapes? Who tends a flock and does not drink the milk? Do I say this merely on human authority? Doesn't the law say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, do not muzzle an ox while it is treading out the grain. Is it about the oxen that God is concerned? Surely he says this for us, doesn't he? Yet this was written for us because whoever plows and threshes should be able to do so in hope of sharing in the harvest. If we have sown spiritual seed among you, is it too much if we reap a material harvest from you? If others have this right of support from you, shouldn't we have it all the more? But we did not use this right. On the contrary, we put up with anything rather than hinder the gospel of Christ. Don't you know that those who serve in the temple get their food from the temple, and that those who serve at the altar share in what is offered on the altar? In the same way, the Lord has commanded that those who preach the gospel should receive their living from the gospel. But I have not used any of these rights, and I am not writing this in the hope that you will do such a thing for me, for I would rather die than allow anyone to deprive me of this boast. For when I preach the gospel, I cannot boast, since I am compelled to preach. Woe to me if I do not preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I have a reward. If not voluntarily, I am simply discharging the trust committed to me. What then is my reward? Just this, that in preaching the gospel I may offer it free of charge, and so not make full use of my rights as a preacher of the gospel. Though I am free and belong to no one, I have made myself a slave to everyone, to win as many as possible. To the Jews I became like a Jew to win the Jews. To those under the law I became like one under the law, though I myself am not under the law, so as to win those under the law. To those not having the law I became like one not having the law, though I am not free from God's law, but am under the law of Christ, so as to win those not having the law. To the weak I became weak to win the weak. I have become all things to all people, so that by all possible means I might save some. I do all this for the sake of the gospel, that I may share in its blessings. Long passage. So the discussion we find here in chapter 9, obviously, chapter 9 is sandwiched between chapters 8 and 10, but this is significant for more than just numerical reasons. It is sandwiched between two chapters which are both addressing some element of sacrificial food. In the ancient world, in ancient Rome at this time, when an animal was butchered, it was usually butchered as part of a sacrifice to a particular deity. Right? It's not as if You had these large farms that would just butcher an animal and stock the grocery stores, and you would just go pick it up. Typically, when butchering take place, it was a cultic act that was to a deity, and certain parts of the animal would actually be fully consumed on the altar to that deity. Other parts might be eaten as part of a sacrificial meal, not completely unlike the bread and wine that we partake in as Christians. And the rest of the meat would be sold in the marketplace. Now, this is crucial to understanding what's going on in these chapters, and particularly to understand the difference between what Paul says in chapter 8 and chapter 10. Because if you read them casually, you might think that Paul is contradicting himself. What is going on, though? As Mike talked about last week in chapter 8, Paul argues there that in principle, at least, it's fine to eat food sacrificed to idols, at least in principle. We see he's actually his problem with what the Corinthians are doing, but in principle, he argues it's fine. But then in chapter 10, he seems to raise problems with eating sacrificial meat. The difference has to do with the cultic context, right? Paul is fine eating meat bought in the marketplace that came from a sacrificial offering. So an animal sacrifice, say a bull, and then they bring some of that meat and they sell it at the marketplace. Paul doesn't have a problem with that because he says that we know as Christians that these gods are basically insubstantial. But then in chapter 10, there's a different context. In chapter 10, he seems to be addressing the problem where Christians are actually going and participating in the cultic meal to that god. They're not just going buying food at the marketplace, they're actually participating in the meal to a pagan deity, and Paul has a big problem with that. Now, I bring this up to kind of explain the broad context, but what I want you to notice is the attitude that the Corinthians possess, that Paul is coming up against in these verses, is an attitude we've actually seen pop up in other parts of 1 Corinthians. At the very end of the conversation in chapter 10, Paul responds to a Corinthian slogan that came up earlier in chapter 6. 10:23. I have the right to do anything, you say, but not everything is beneficial. I have the right to do anything, but not everything is constructive. No one should seek their own good, but the good of others. Like I said in chapter 6, we find the same refrain on the lips of the Corinthians. I have the right to do anything. And there the Corinthians are asserting this right to frequent prostitutes. Paul responds in brief to their assertion of their so-called rights in chapter 6. But in chapters 8 to 10, we find a much fuller response, I think, to this assertion. I want to summarize what I think Paul's response is to this Corinthian assertion of their rights to do something with 3 points. Point 1. I think Paul affirms that Christians do have certain rights granted by God and certain responsibilities that attend these rights. In verses 3 through 12, Paul argues that as an apostle, he has the rights to take a wife and to receive financial support from the Corinthians. Moreover, these rights, he says, are grounded in the scriptures themselves and the revealed will of God. Right? That's why he looks at the law, to ground this idea that the ox should essentially receive of what it's treading. He should not be muzzled. But his assertion to the right of financial support, notice this is the first kind of important point. It assumes that a right that someone possesses also entails responsibility for others in that person's community. A right to financial support is meaningless apart from the accepted social responsibility of those in his community to support him. It means nothing for Paul to claim he has the right if it is not recognized in a social context. The assertion of the right without its recognition is meaningless. The concept of shared social responsibility, that we all have obligations to each other, is often missing in current discussion of rights. And I'm going to use one particularly controversial illustration. When people argue about abortion, for example, the argument often turns on whether the woman's rights over her own body are being violated if she is not allowed to terminate the pregnancy, or whether the child in her womb is being subjected to a violation of his or her basic right to life. We pin the rights of people against each other and end up with competing claims to what our right is, or the right of this one is, over against the right of another. Such competing claims over rights occur, I believe, because we have forgotten that this language of rights only really work. They only really have weight when they come in a context in which our obligations and duties to one another are recognized and appreciated. How much different would the conversation about abortion look like if we ask primarily not what the woman's rights or the child's rights are, but rather what the responsibilities and duties a mother has to her child, and what the responsibilities and duties we as a people, and especially we as a church, have to mother and child. In other words, if the church created a culture in which children are seen as precious and mothers are supported and encouraged, we might not need to appeal to the language of rights and the attendant competition that comes with it so often. In such a context, it'll be much easier for a mother who finds herself with an unexpected and perhaps unwanted pregnancy to ask not, do I have a right to an abortion, but rather, how can I ensure my child flourishes, even in the midst of these difficult circumstances? Point 2. Point 2 is this: Paul grounds rights in the revealed will of God and not in human autonomy. Rights are grounded in the will of God, not in human autonomy. In chapter 6, in response to the assertion that these Corinthian men have a right to frequent prostitutes, Paul tells the Corinthians that their bodies were purchased by the Lord. They are no longer their own, and thus it follows they do not have these rights over their own bodies any longer. Now, the element of this message that we easily miss today is the way that it completely subverts the assumptions of these powerful men in Corinth. You see, the assumed right that they have to frequent prostitutes is dependent upon a slave culture in which the bodies of prostitutes are viewed merely as property. A woman who is a prostitute has no rights at all. And it is only in such a context that a man can think that he actually has rights. I have the right to do anything, even over someone else's body. You see, in Rome, one of the big things that's changed, there's no concept of human rights. Rather, there's the rights of the citizen, there's the rights of the rich, there's the rights of those who have legal protection, but there's no rights that are intrinsic to humanity. And because of that, even in the church, these Roman men could assert their rights over someone else's body and think this is somehow in line with the gospel. Rights were a privilege of the powerful. But Paul says that those men who assume they have these rights have been purchased by the Lord. Now, don't miss this. Language of purchasing, when we're talking about humans, is slave language. Paul looks at these men who assume that they have certain rights over other people, namely slaves, and said, actually, it is they who have been purchased by the Lord. They have become slaves of Christ. And because God has purchased these powerful men in Corinth, their rights are now determined by the will of God and not by prevailing cultural or even legal norms. because of this, they no longer have sexual rights over any slave. As Paul says a little bit later in chapter 7, they have rights over their spouse's body, but their spouse also has rights over theirs. So even there's mutuality and not possession of someone else. Their sexuality is now at the service of their master who bought them. Their rights are subservient to God. These Corinthian men were taking their cues of what their rights were from the culture around them, from the waters in which they swam, which for the most part only recognized rights for wealthy male citizens. But Paul grounds his conception of rights in the will of God as revealed in the scriptures, and here in the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus. This same temptation is ever present for us. It is ever present. The language of rights is so pervasive in our culture. Like I said at the beginning, we use it every day. We must, however, be very wary of assuming that everything our culture believes about rights is in fact right. We need to call the rightness of our so-called rights into question. It may be that some of the rights we assert are built upon ungodly and oppressive ways of thinking, similar to the so-called rights of the Corinthian men over a slave body. This would not have been questioned even by most slaves. It's simply the waters in which they swam. They assumed that rights were divided up like this, of some over others. When we get into competing claims about our rights versus the rights of someone else, we need to stop and ask, am I really subjecting this conversation to the gospel, or am I allowing the competitive culture in which we live and in which we swim to influence the way I think about the gospel rather than vice versa? Point 3. It's my last point, then I'm gonna bring it home. This is a tough one. Paul instructs us that it is not rights, but love that should motivate us as Christians. Everything Paul says about his rights in chapter 9, that I already looked at, he only says in order to make the point that he has given them up for the sake of the gospel. In other words, even if Paul recognizes a certain conception of rights, he only does so in order to say, but I've given all these up. It's en route to a bigger point he wants to make. Because the Corinthians were obsessed with their rights, they wanted to make sure that everyone knew they had the right to eat meat that came from a sacrificial animal. As Mike talked about last week, they were proud of their knowledge that those gods didn't have any real significance. Their knowledge then led them to flaunt their freedom, their right to eat sacrificial meat. Paul affirms that, sure, they actually do have that right based on that knowledge. Just as he affirms he also has the right to take a wife and the right to receive financial support. But he doesn't take advantage of these rights. Rather, he's chosen to surrender his rights to a wife and to financial support for the sake of the gospel. The Corinthians are more concerned with their right to eat a meal than they are with offending their conscience of their Christian brothers and sisters. Think about that. But for Paul, all Christian ethics is ultimately grounded in the example of Christ. Think about that. They're more concerned with flaunting the fact that they have the knowledge, that they have this right that they can eat meat, than they are with deeply offending their Christian brothers and sisters. I was in the Target parking lot a few weeks ago, and these girls were walking, talking, and one was upset about another, and she stops just, starts just cursing left and right. And my kids are walking with me, and her friend goes, something like, shh, there's kids. And she goes, well, they're going to have to grow up someday. Now, I understand she might have been angry. I don't know the context. But you can see that attitude, right? That I have this right, and I'm angry, and so, To hell with everyone else. Now, we all slip into this, right? I'm not trying to pick on her. I have no idea what her context is, and I've done things that are far more despicable than that. But God forbid that we should actually clothe up the selfish, un-Christ-like attitude with language of rights or something like that. That we actually begin to morally justify these wicked attitudes is really problematic. When we sin, okay, we're going to sin, and that's why Christ has died. That's why we have forgiveness, and that's why we can repent. But we can't morally justify them with language of rights or freedoms because we're Americans or because we're Christians or anything else. The closest thing we get to, what I would say is a thesis statement for the book of 1 Corinthians appears in chapter 1, verse 18. There, Paul says, the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. Christianity is based upon the Son of God voluntarily surrendering all of his rights and dying the death of a common criminal. Jesus gave up his divine rights. We talk about human rights. Jesus had rights as God. He gave these up. He gave up his right to be worshipped on earth and became a servant and lived out that ethic, the ethic of service, even to the point of dying the death of a slave. And the Corinthians are worried about asserting their rights over food. Your conscience be damned as long as I can eat what's within my rights to eat. This attitude is antithetical to the gospel. This focus on rights, even rights which are good in themselves, is antithetical to the way of Jesus, who sacrificed all of his rights for our sake. What person, and think about it, what one of us would not assert our right to bodily autonomy, right? Our right to not have someone else violate our body if faced with the prospect of torture. When I was in the military, I did survival, evasion, resistance, and escape school. And there, they don't really torture you. They don't actually harm your body. But just using things like tight places and cold water, they can induce a level of discomfort that'll pretty much get you to tell them anything they want. And this is a training environment. And Jesus had the flesh torn off his body voluntarily. He had divine rights, divine prerogatives. Jesus affirmed when he was tempted by the devil that he could have called a legion of angels to his side at any moment. And in the prospect of torture, in the prospect of one of the most heinous deaths that you could die, crucifixion, Jesus surrenders his right. He accepted this torture and this death for our sake. This revelation must be the guiding ethic for the Christian. This has to be our starting point. Not language about rights, but this ethic. It is not enough just to rightly understand what our rights as a Christian are, and that is important. But understanding those rights is just the beginning. We must get beyond that to the place where we are willing to even then place these rights at the feet of Jesus. So that's my final point that I see coming out of this passage. And in closing, I want to think about some of the ways that this applies. And I'm going to kind of take what I think is an easy one. Some might disagree, and of course you're free to disagree. The application is always the messy part. But for me, this is an easy one, and then I'm going to take one that's a lot tougher that'll raise a lot more questions than I answer. So the first example I want to talk about to illustrate some of the ways these principles might work out is yoga. Now you may be aware that yoga has sometimes engendered some serious debate among Christians because of its association with Hinduism. Right? Many see it because of this as inherently idolatrous. Christians should not practice yoga. Other Christians argue that the core elements of yoga are stretching and deep breathing, right? Both of which are good and healthy practices in themselves. What would Paul think about this? Maybe I'm wrong. I think this is actually kind of an easy one. I think from the message today, from the principles we see Paul apply, that Paul would affirm the Christian freedom to practice the physical forms of yoga, right? The stretching and deep breathing. I think he would see them as God's good creation, just like the way he refuses to let meat, even that is sacrificed to an idol, be seen as, somehow polluted in itself. It is a part of God's good creation. But I do think he would caution us against participating in a yoga class which included the spiritual elements from pagan religious practices. Right? Paul says the sacrificial meat is fine, the sacrificial meal is not. And I think he would likewise say that stretching and deep breathing are fine as long as they're not done in a spiritually idolatrous context. But more importantly, I think Paul would also insist that as a Christian we should be more concerned than about establishing our right to practice a certain form of yoga, that we should be more concerned about our brothers and sisters if they express offense by this, if they express a lack of understanding. We should be more concerned about their reaction, the ways we might damage their faith, than we are about asserting our rights. Right? When Paul is talking to the Corinthians about the unjust ways they practice the Lord's Supper, that the rich come and get and stuff themselves and leave nothing for the poor, he says, aren't there food in your homes to go eat in? And I think Paul here might say something like, you can stretch at home, you don't need to assert that right to other Christians who might find it deeply offensive. Love trumps knowledge, and love for a brother or sister should always take precedence over the assertion of a right to stretch. Now let's consider a far more difficult scenario. What does a Christian, an individual, or a community do when they find themselves experiencing unjust oppression? And this is one of those topics that I think we really need to wrestle with today. I want to be careful what I say, but we just witnessed an insurrection at the Capitol, in part because of people's belief that rights to fairness, rights to freedom were being violated. There's certain elements, albeit I believe fringe and small elements, but certain elements that I think would be happy to see civil war if it meant the furtherance of their rights. We as Christians really need to wrestle with these things. What is a Christian individual or community to do when they find themselves experiencing unjust oppression? Should a spouse who is being abused, for example, give up her rights to bodily autonomy for the sake of her spouse? Is the civil rights movement wrong? Right? And the civil rights movement is about the assertion of rights. Rights that are actually completely denied to them. Was it wrong? Am I saying that even in cases of unjust oppression, that communities who are weak, who are oppressed, must just accept the oppression? No, I think it's a little more messy than that. We must remember when we read passages like this that Paul's strongest condemnation comes to those not who are in positions of weakness and powerless, but are actually to the strong. The assertion of rights in the Roman context was coming from primarily rich, wealthy, male citizens. There's one time in 1 Corinthians where Paul actually asserts someone's right. He used the term authority, but he asserts it to make a point. We'll talk about this in a few months. But it has to do with women and head coverings. And he says a woman has authority over her own head. He affirms it. And this is the only time in the book that he makes an unqualified affirmation of someone's authority. And it's a woman over the question of head coverings. It's not the males who want to frequent prostitutes. It's not these people who want to flaunt their right to food. It's someone who's relatively disempowered. That he makes an assertion of authority, an assertion of rights to bolster his argument. That ought to give us pause in applying the message of the cross in ways that could actually serve to further oppression. We always have to ask, in thinking about this, are actions actually an imitation of Jesus that is giving up his rights, or are they an imitation of the soldiers who nailed Jesus to the cross? Do we have the power and the ability to nail him to the cross, and that's what we're doing? Or are we giving up some of our divine rights for the sake of love for others? It is messy. Paul, for example, it's even messy in his life. He asserts his rights as a Roman citizen in the book of Acts to demand a fair trial. So Paul doesn't always give up his rights. Let's not be confused here. How do we determine then what is good, when it is good, for us to assert our rights, and when we ought to give them up? It's a difficult question. But here's some of the ways that I think about it. I think we have to situate this conversation in an ethic, like I said, of not only the cross, but of also love, right? Love is what motivated the cross. And we always need to ask, what does love demand? In many cases, allowing yourself, or certainly someone you know, but even yourself, to be abused would not be an act of love, but simply of fear. In my experience, and I've been in many domestic situations in my job, people are not allowing themselves to be abused because of some act of heroic love. It's rather because of deep brokenness and a lack of self-worth. And we cannot sit here and pretend like that is somehow heroic. That's sad. That's tragic. And someone who's in that situation can't even actually adequately, think through it to know whether they're making the decisions from a place of love or merely from a place of weakness. It is not necessarily loving to allow someone to continue in sinful and abusive patterns unchecked. Sometimes the most loving act is an act of rebuke and resistance. Justice is certainly about protecting the vulnerable, but it is also about reproving the reprobate. There is this biblical tradition about correcting the fool, about reproving the reprobate, and the good it does to that person. That's why we discipline our children. One of the things that also makes these situations so difficult, as I've already alluded to, is the ways they're often bound up with relations of power. If someone is upset with the sermon today afterward and comes up and slaps me on the face, I hope I would turn the other cheek as an act of love. But I don't have to. I think I can handle my own with most people here. But I hope I would give up my rights, in that case, to self-defense, or more appropriately, to retaliation, right? Because a slap isn't a big deal. For the sake of love, for the sake of modeling the love of Christ. If that same person, however, is angry, and so he slaps my daughter Olivia, who's 4, I do not believe it would be right or fitting for me to turn the other cheek for her. As her father, I believe that I have a responsibility to protect and defend her. Abused children aren't raised with the value of pacifism and love. They're raised with very low self-worth. Turning the other cheek, I believe, would not be an option in such a situation. Nevertheless, a moderate and restrained act of violence could still be an act of love, not only to Olivia, whom I have a duty to protect, but also to the offender. It can be an act of love to check someone when they go too far. In bringing up these examples, I realize that I am raising far more questions than I'm answering, as I stated at the beginning. But I think this is inevitable if we're going to be a faithful witness in this complicated world. Simple answers are rarely adequate at addressing the complexity of life. And if I close a message like today by telling Christians that they must always give up their rights, certain of us would hear it and say, oh, amen, that's a strong message, that's a good message. But those who have been a victim of oppression, of abuse, might say, well, I know what it is to have my rights trampled. I know what it is to not have anyone stand up for my rights. But I want to know, what does God say to me in the midst of these oppressive situations? And we must remember that the law and the prophets come before the New Testament and provide a framework for understanding the radical act of Jesus. And part of that framework is a message of justice that rings out, and a message of reproof for anyone who would lord their authority over those who are weak. God is coming to vindicate the weak and the oppressed. And far be it from us that the message of the cross would become a way of actually keeping people down and oppressed. We must think carefully about these things. We must let the entire biblical testimony bear witness. I want to close then with 3 points. And look, one of the biggest takeaways is, because these things are so complicated, because on the one hand we have many Christians who are very concerned with rights, for example, things like free speech beginning to be pulled back and the disastrous consequences that could have on the church. We need to think carefully about this. There are some times when I believe it's the duty of the church to stand up and to say, no, this is wrong. And if within the power we have to fight, so to speak, for our rights. But there are some times where the blood of the martyr is the seat of the church. And when we need to say, no, it would be better to suffer for the sake of Christ than to fight. And I don't always know where that line is. It's complicated. But the only way we're going to be able to be a faithful witness is if we soak ourselves in the language of Jesus, in the mind of Christ, and we really allow Him to shape not only our thoughts, but our desires. Amen. So that when we're faced with those tough situations, we do act faithfully. Amen. The worship team can come up. I just have a couple things to say to close. I want to reiterate the 3 points. Give them their notes back. I want to reiterate the 3 points that I discussed in my sermon, and kind of as an application. So the first is this: where there are rights, there are also social responsibilities to one another. And we must attend to our responsibilities to one another. If you believe you have a right, someone else probably has that right too. And if they have that right, it means you have certain obligations. So, think carefully about what your rights are. 2, ground your concept and rights not in the culture, but in the will of God. And this comes again to doing serious thinking in scriptures, in the Christian tradition, and on the cross. Root your minds in those realities. And 3, and perhaps most importantly, let love and not rights be what motivates you. Let that be your starting point. I do think it's better to start with the ethic of the cross, to start with the way of Jesus nailed to the cross, and then to say, but in this situation we might need to fight. because this is deeply unjust, than it is to start from the position of rights, to start from the position of, this is my authority, this is my status, and then kind of think about love as an afterthought. We have to start from the other place, especially those of us who've been used to power and comfort in America. Cough, cough, white evangelical church. As a final takeaway, something really practical. I didn't add this to my sermon notes because I thought about it after. We're in the season of Lent. I know a guy who said he was giving up pornography for Lent. Good for him, I guess.
That's obedience.
Yeah, so the whole thing with fasting, for those of you who might be confused, fasting doesn't mean giving up your favorite sin. It means giving up something that you actually have a Christian right to. Lent invites us. It is a season in which we are invited to give up our rights over certain things voluntarily in order to draw our attention to Jesus, who gave up all his rights at Golgotha. That is what Lent is about. So maybe, we're a few weeks into Lent now, maybe you haven't started observing it. I want to invite you to. It doesn't have to be big. I'm not giving you anything major for Lent, but it's kind of big to me. It's those things that I like to assert my right to do. And those are what I'm giving up. And every time I give it up, I think, if this is hard for me, that's kind of pathetic, because think about what Jesus gave up. But more importantly, this practice, we often think as evangelicals, it's easy to think that Christianity is primarily something that takes place in our mind. We think right thoughts, and that'll somehow prepare us for really hard decisions. And then we wonder why, when we're faced with difficult things, we mess up horribly, we sin horribly, and we don't act in Christ-like ways. Maybe it's because our thoughts are only halfway there to reforming us and making us like Jesus. Maybe there are practices and actions that help take us the remainder of that way. And fasting is a practice in giving up your rights. And it is a practice which focuses your desires not on things of this earth. It's weird to give up food, right? Even if you only give it up like a meal a day. It's weird because it's not only natural, but it's necessary, and you feel it when you give it up. But it teaches your body not to be driven by the love of comfort, by the love of ease, but rather to be focused upon the cross, to be focused on Jesus, to let the love of Jesus be your guiding ethic. So I would encourage you, if you're looking for a really practical way, how do I implement this desire, this teaching in my life? Enter into the Lenten season. Give something up, and so teach your body what it means to give up your rights for the love of Jesus. Let's pray.